"Shut your trap, idiot," the little girl blurted out as the teacher attempted to humiliate her, unaware she spoke 30 languages. "Comment and rate my story from 0 to 10. Your opinion is very important. Subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help." The screams sliced through the stuffy afternoon air like a knife, echoing through the cobblestone streets of the historic town at precisely 3 o'clock. The 52-year-old widowed millionaire almost dropped his coffee cup as he stepped away from the window of his luxury apartment. It was always at the same time, always with the same desperate intensity. For 3 weeks straight, that sound had been coming from the old Victorian house across the street, a faded yellow 2-story building with peeling blue window frames that clashed with the elegance of the modern building where he lived. "Must be a kid throwing a tantrum," he muttered to himself, adjusting his tie before returning to his work. As the owner of the largest construction company in the region, he was accustomed to solving complex problems, but he preferred to keep his distance from other people's dramas, especially after 5 years of living alone. Ever since he lost his wife on a rainy night, he preferred not to remember. Across the street, inside the Victorian house, the 4-year-old girl huddled in the corner of the kitchen, her years insufficient to understand why her aunt hated her so much. The 38-year-old woman held a metal spoon firmly, having heated it on the gas stove, her eyes bloodshot from the booze she'd been drinking since noon, fixed on the girl trembling before her. "You're a blight on this house," the aunt hissed, her voice slurred from the cheap whiskey she'd been swilling. "Because of you, my sister's gone. Because of you, I lost everything." The spoon came down hard on the girl's small arm, leaving a red mark that joined the other scars that dotted her skinny arms. The child bit her lip to keep from screaming louder. She had learned that screaming only enraged her aunt further, who had worked at City Hall until she was fired for constant absenteeism caused by her addiction. The girl closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's soft voice, singing that lullaby before bed. It was all that was left of her now, fragments of memories and a melody that insisted on echoing in her mind during the most painful moments. "Stop your sniveling," the aunt grunted, putting the spoon away in the cupboard as if it were the most natural gesture in the world. "Go to your room, and I don't want to see you until tomorrow. And if you get charcoal on the walls again with that filthy stuff, you'll see what real punishment is." The girl ran to the small room at the back of the house, a stuffy space with an old bed and a crucifix on the wall. There, she curled up in the thin sheet and began to hum her mother's lullaby softly, the only thing that still comforted her. She didn't know that across the street someone had finally paid attention to that melody. The millionaire stopped reviewing the contracts when he heard the faint but distinct sound. He knew that song. His wife used to sing it when she was cooking, a folk song about free birds. But where was it coming from? He approached the window again, his eyes scanning the facade of the Victorian house. One of the back windows was ajar, and from there came that childish voice, trembling but persistent. For the first time in 3 weeks, he felt something other than simple annoyance. There was something in that voice that struck a sensitive chord in his chest, something that reminded him of responsibilities long buried under layers of work and isolation. Next door to the Victorian house, the 61-year-old retired schoolteacher was watering her begonias when she heard the girl singing. Unlike the businessman, she could no longer ignore the signs. During her 40 years teaching elementary school, she had developed a sixth sense for children in distress. And that voice carried a pain that made her heart ache. How strange, she thought, observing the windows of the house she had known for decades. The family had always been troubled, but ever since the aunt had taken custody of her orphan niece, something had changed in the atmosphere of that house. The girl never played in the yard, never ran through the streets like the other children of the historic town. The teacher dried her hands on her apron and made a decision. The next morning, she would pay a courtesy visit to her neighbor. It had been a long time since she had spoken to her properly, and perhaps it was time to get to know the little child better. The businessman remained at the window, an uncomfortable feeling growing in his chest. The song had stopped, but something in those few minutes had awakened memories that he preferred to keep dormant. Memories of his former employee, who had abruptly resigned 5 years ago, a few months before the accident. She was a gentle woman, always humming while organizing the construction company's files. Then, suddenly, she had simply disappeared from his life, leaving only a formal resignation letter and many unanswered questions. He had never thought about her again until he heard that familiar song echoing from a house where a child seemed to suffer in silence. The sun began to set over the mountains that surrounded the town when the girl finally fell asleep, exhausted by pain and fear. Her small fingers clutched the sheet, and in her dreams she flew like the birds she secretly drew on the kitchen walls with pieces of charcoal found in the backyard. Across the street, the millionaire closed the curtains and tried to return to his work, but he couldn't concentrate. Something had changed that afternoon, something that he didn't yet fully understand. For the first time in years, he felt that perhaps it was time to pay attention to what was happening beyond his own windows. Night fell on the historic town, but the echo of that children's song continued to resonate in the mind of a man who had spent 5 years running from his responsibilities, and a retired teacher who had never been able to ignore the suffering of a child. The next morning brought with it the aroma of fresh bread from the local bakeries and the typical hustle and bustle of the town, waking up for another day. The teacher put on her best floral dress and combed her grey hair with extra care. There was something in that child's voice that wouldn't leave her alone, an echo of hopelessness that she recognized from her years as an educator. At 9 o'clock sharp, she knocked on the door of the Victorian house. The sound echoed through the silent interior until shuffling footsteps approached. The aunt opened the door with a puffy face and bloodshot eyes, clearly suffering the effects of the previous night's drinking. "Good morning," the teacher said with her gentlest smile. "I've come to pay a courtesy visit. It's been so long since we've had a proper chat." The woman hesitated, running a hand through her disheveled hair. "Oh, Mrs. Davison, It's not a good time. The house is a mess." "Nonsense, dear. We've been neighbours for so long." The teacher stepped forward, forcing the aunt to back away. "And I'd love to meet your niece. I hear she's a darling little girl." The aunt's face hardened for an instant before forcing a strained smile. "The girl is sick, high fever, best not to get close." At that moment, a soft noise came from the kitchen, the sound of something being dragged on the floor. The teacher perked up her ears, immediately recognizing the sound of a child trying to move silently. "Perhaps I can help," the teacher insisted. "I have experience with sick children. Raised 3 myself, you know how it is." "No need, really," the aunt replied quickly, blocking the entrance with her body. "I've already taken her to the doctor. It's just a cold. It'll pass soon." The teacher noticed the woman's nervous hands, the way she avoided eye contact, and especially the strong smell of alcohol that emanated from her even though it was so early. All the signs she had learned to recognize during decades of dealing with troubled families. Across the street, the millionaire watched the scene from his window while eating breakfast. He had woken up earlier than usual, disturbed by confused dreams where the voice of a child mingled with memories of his former employee. When he saw the teacher at the door of the Victorian house, a strange curiosity washed over him. The teacher finally said goodbye to the aunt, but not before casting an investigative look at the interior of the house. There was something deeply wrong there, and her experience told her that a child was suffering. Inside the Victorian house, the aunt slammed the door shut and headed to the kitchen, where she found the girl crouched behind the table, trying to hide. The child had tried to reach a glass of water from the sink, but her height didn't allow it, and she had knocked over a chair in the process. "Didn't I tell you to stay in your room?" the aunt growled, her irritation intensified by the hangover and the unexpected visit. "I was thirsty, Auntie," the girl mumbled, her big eyes fixed on the floor. "Thirsty?" The aunt laughed bitterly. "You want water? Then go get it in the yard. And since you like to make so much noise, you can stay out there until I decide you can come in." The girl went out to the small backyard, a space surrounded by high walls and dominated by a single maple tree. There, she sat on the ground and began to draw with a piece of charcoal she had found near the stove. It was always birds, small, big, some flying, others perched on imaginary branches. Each stroke represented her dream of freedom, of flying away from that house where pain was her only constant companion. The hours passed slowly. The aunt had locked the back door, leaving the girl in the yard under the hot midday sun. The child began to feel dizzy, but she knew that knocking on the door would only result in more punishment. So she began to hum her mother's lullaby softly, the melody being her only source of comfort. It was this melody that reached the millionaire's ears again. This time, he couldn't ignore it. There was something too familiar about that voice, that specific song. He grabbed his cell phone and almost without thinking began to record. He didn't know exactly why, but an instinct told him that he might need that evidence. As he recorded, fragments of memories began to fit together in his mind. His employee hummed that same song while working. The woman who had been an exemplary employee until she disappeared abruptly. She who always spoke fondly about her little girl. A girl named Girlie, the businessman muttered, his cell phone trembling in his hands. His former employee's daughter was named the same as the affectionate nickname she used. The realization hit him like a punch to the stomach. The child suffering in the house across the street was the daughter of his former employee, the gentle woman who had worked for him for 3 years before simply disappearing. How hadn't he made that connection before? The millionaire put away his cell phone and began to walk back and forth in his apartment. He vaguely remembered his employee mentioning family problems, a sister she didn't get along with, financial difficulties. But he was so absorbed in his own problems at the time, the growing conflicts with his wife, the problems at the company, that he hadn't paid proper attention. Now, 5 years later, his ex-employee's daughter was across the street, and from the sounds coming from that house, she wasn't in a good situation. The guilt he carried for the loss of his wife multiplied, now including the regret for not having helped when she clearly needed it. At 3 o'clock precisely, the screams started again. This time the businessman didn't turn away from the window. He watched with growing horror as through the kitchen window of the Victorian house he saw a female silhouette moving aggressively. He grabbed his cell phone again and began to record, this time with more determination. What he saw through the cell phone screen made him nauseous. The aunt was holding something in her hands. It seemed to be a kitchen utensil, and gesturing violently toward a small figure that he could barely distinguish. The girl's screams echoed through the afternoon, and this time the millionaire couldn't pretend they were just childish tantrums. When the silence returned, he remained at the window for a few more minutes, his heart pounding in his chest. He had just witnessed something that would change everything. The question now was, what would he do with that information? His fortune, built through smart investments in stocks and bonds, had always given him the power to solve any problem. His assets included valuable properties, a diversified investment portfolio, and even some investments in cryptocurrencies that had appreciated substantially in recent years. But in the face of that situation, all his wealth seemed useless. That night, the girl slept on the floor of the backyard, where the aunt had left her as punishment for making too much noise during the afternoon. The child curled up in her own t-shirt and looked at the stars through the branches of the maple tree. In her 4-year-old mind, she made a silent wish to her mother, wherever she was, that someone, anyone, would take her away from that place of pain. Across the street, the businessman couldn't sleep, tormented by the certainty that he needed to act, but paralyzed by the same emotional inertia that had consumed him since his wife's departure. 3 days had passed since the millionaire discovered the child's identity, and guilt consumed him like a slow fire. During those days, he had systematically documented the episodes of violence, always at 3 o'clock, always with the same methodical brutality. His collection of videos and audios grew, but his courage to act remained paralyzed by the same cowardice that had haunted him since the night he lost his wife. On that Thursday morning, the teacher made a decision that would change the course of everything. She had spent the night awake, tormented by the certainty that a child was suffering a few feet from her house. Her 4 decades as an educator had taught her to recognize the signs, and all of them were present in the Victorian house. She decided to approach the situation differently. Instead of attempting a new direct visit to the aunt, she opted for a more subtle strategy. At 7 in the morning, she positioned herself in the side yard of her house, the place from where she had the best view of the backyard of the Victorian house. What she saw left her horrified. The girl was sitting under the maple tree, completely alone, wearing only a torn t-shirt and underwear. Her small arms were marked by obvious burns, some still red and inflamed. The child drew on the ground with a piece of charcoal, creating shapes that the teacher recognized as birds. "Good heavens," Mrs. Davison whispered, her hands trembling as she gripped the fence that separated the yards. It was worse than she imagined, much worse. The girl looked up and saw the lady watching her. For a moment, the two stared at each other in silence. Then, to the teacher's surprise, the child smiled, a weak but genuine smile, and waved shyly. "Hi, Grandma," the girl said in her tiny voice, using the affectionate term she gave to all elderly ladies. "Hi, sweetheart," Mrs. Davison replied, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Are you okay?" The girl glanced quickly at the windows of the house before answering. "I'm fine. Just drawing birdies." "How lovely. Do you like birds?" "I like them a lot. They can fly wherever they want," the child replied, her big eyes shining with a sadness that broke the educator's heart. At that moment, the aunt's harsh voice echoed from inside the house. "Girl, where are you?" The terror that instantly took over the child's face said everything Mrs. Davison needed to know. The girl got up quickly, wiped her hands on her t-shirt and ran into the house, but not before looking once more at the educator with an expression that screamed for help. The teacher remained in the yard for a few more minutes, processing what she had seen. The burns, the fear, the way the child reacted to the aunt's voice, everything confirmed her worst fears. She could no longer pretend she didn't know what was happening. Meanwhile, across the street, the millionaire had witnessed the entire interaction. Through his window, he could see the yard partially, and the sight of the marks on the girl's arms made him sick. For the first time in 5 years, he felt genuine fury burning in his chest. His former employee had trusted him in some way. Even if indirectly, even if he didn't know it at the time, she had left her daughter in the care of a family that lived in the same town where he lived. And now, this child was being tortured while he watched from his comfortable window, paralyzed by his own cowardice. At 11 in the morning, Mrs. Davison made a courageous decision. She put on her best dress, grabbed a tray of homemade cookies she had baked as a pretext, and headed again to the Victorian house. This time, she wouldn't take no for an answer. The aunt answered the door reluctantly, clearly annoyed by the neighbor's insistence. "Mrs. Davison, I already told you it's not a good time." "Dear, I brought some cookies I made yesterday," the educator interrupted firmly, "and I insist on getting to know the little one better. As long-time neighbors, it's our duty to support each other." Before the aunt could protest, Mrs. Davison had already entered the house, using all the authority that decades of classroom teaching had given her. The interior of the Victorian house was dark and smelled of mildew mixed with alcohol. Old and poorly maintained furniture occupied the living room, and there was a heavy atmosphere that made the air seem difficult to breathe. "The girl is sleeping," the aunt lied, blocking the path to the back of the house. "What a pity. Maybe another time then," Mrs. Davison said, but her experienced eyes had already catalogued several disturbing details. Dark stains on the kitchen floor that seemed to have been poorly cleaned, a metal spoon left on the stove, and mainly small charcoal drawings on the walls that had clearly been made by a child. At that moment, a low sound came from the direction of the kitchen, a muffled sob, almost imperceptible. Mrs. Davison and the aunt froze. The silence that followed was tense and revealing. "Must be the neighbor's cat," the aunt said quickly, but her voice trembled slightly. The educator smiled and nodded, but had decided she had seen enough. "Well, I'll let you rest then. But remember that I'm always right next door if you need anything. Anything at all." The teacher's tone made it clear that it wasn't just a casual offer of help. It was a subtle but direct warning. After the neighbor left, the aunt slammed the door shut and headed to the kitchen, where she found the girl huddled behind the stove, trying to hide. The child had cried upon hearing the teacher's gentle voice, remembering the kindness she had once known. "You were making noise," accused the aunt, her eyes already shining with familiar fury. "No, Auntie, I didn't make noise," the girl protested, but her small voice sounded weak even to her. The aunt grabbed the metal spoon that was on the stove and placed it directly on the flame. The girl recognized the ritual and began to tremble. She knew what was coming next. "You want to get attention, don't you?" the woman hissed as the spoon heated up. "Want the neighbors to come here asking questions? You think I don't know how to take care of you?" Across the street, the millionaire had positioned his cell phone at the window and was recording again. This time, he managed to capture not only the sounds, but also partial images through the kitchen window. What he saw made him make a decision that would change everything. He could no longer be just a silent observer. His former employee had been a good person, a dedicated worker who always spoke of her daughter with love. That child was his responsibility now, whether he wanted it or not. While the girl suffered another episode of systematic torture, the businessman made a call he hadn't made in months. He called his personal attorney and old college friend. "Robert, I need your help with a delicate situation," he said, watching through the window as the child's screams echoed through the afternoon. "It's about a child, and I think it might be a matter of life." His financial resources, which included millions in diversified investments, accounts in euros maintained for international investments, and even a considerable reserve in physical gold stored in bank vaults, would finally have a purpose that went beyond the simple multiplication of capital. His wealth, built through decades of hard work in the real estate market and smart investments, would be used to save a life. That night, after the aunt fell asleep drunk on the living room sofa, the girl managed to slip quietly into the backyard. Her new burns stung, but the physical pain was less than the pain in her heart. She sat under the maple tree and looked at the stars, humming her mother's song softly. What she didn't know was that for the first time in months, someone was truly paying attention to her suffering, and that, in the coming days, her life would change in ways she couldn't even imagine. The lawyer arrived at the millionaire's apartment on Friday morning with a grave expression on his face. The two men had been colleagues at the university almost 3 decades ago, and Robert knew well the emotional isolation that his friend had built after the loss of his wife. That's why the urgent phone call the night before had surprised him so much. "I need you to tell me exactly what's going on," Robert said, sitting in the apartment's spacious living room. "You spoke about a child in danger, but I need details." The businessman poured coffee and stood by the window, the place that had become his obsession in recent days. "The girl who lives in the house across the street is the daughter of a former employee of mine. She's being mistreated by the aunt who takes care of her." "Mistreated how?" Robert asked, taking a notepad from his briefcase. "Burns, daily screams, neglect." The millionaire paused, struggling with the words. "I have recordings, Robert, evidence of what's happening." Robert was silent for a moment, processing the information. This is very serious. If you have evidence of child abuse, you need to contact Child Protective Services immediately." "I know," the businessman replied, running his hands over his face. "But there's something else. The employee worked for me for 3 years. She left abruptly in 2019, a few months before the accident. I never understood why, but now you feel responsible," Robert completed, understanding the emotional complexity of the situation. The millionaire nodded. "If I had paid more attention at the time, maybe I could have helped. Maybe she wouldn't have needed to leave her daughter with that woman." At that moment, the familiar sound of screams echoed from the house across the street, even though it was only 9 in the morning. Both men turned to the window, and Robert could see the expression of anguish on his friend's face. "This happens every day?" he asked, horrified. "At 3 o'clock religiously, but sometimes at other times too," the businessman replied, grabbing his cell phone. "Want to see the recordings?" Robert watched the videos in growing silence, his face paling with each scene. As a lawyer specializing in family law, he had seen many cases of child abuse, but something in the systematization of that violence deeply disturbed him. "We can't wait any longer. I need you to give me all these recordings right away. I'm going to contact Child Protective Services and the district attorney. This child needs to be removed from that house immediately." While the two men planned the intervention, across the street, the girl lived another day of terror. The aunt had woken up with a particularly severe hangover and discovered that there was no more alcohol in the house. Her irritation multiplied when she found new drawings of birds that the child had made on the kitchen wall during the early morning. "How many times do I need to tell you not to mess up the walls?" the woman shouted, holding the girl by the arm with enough force to leave marks. "You're a pest, a curse on this house." The child tried to explain, to say that she had dreamed of her mother and that the drawings made her feel less alone, but the words were lost in sobs. At 4 years old, she still didn't fully understand why her aunt hated her so much, why each day brought new pain. "You're going to be locked in the room until I decide what to do with you," continued the aunt, pushing the girl down the hall. "And if I hear even a noise, you'll know a punishment you've never experienced before." The room where the girl was locked was small and stuffy, with only a high window that she couldn't reach. There, she curled up in the corner and began to hum her mother's song softly, the melody being her only source of comfort in a world that seemed to have forgotten that she existed. It was this song that Mrs. Davison heard when she passed by the house on her way to the grocery store. The educator had spent the entire night thinking about the conversation with the girl in the yard, the marks she had seen on the child's arms, the atmosphere of fear that permeated that house. Mrs. Davison stopped in front of the gate and listened. The girl's voice was weak, but loaded with a sadness that made the educator's heart break. At that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going to the grocery store, Mrs. Davison headed directly to the city center, where the small Child Protective Services office was located. She knew the counselor well, a former student of hers who had dedicated herself to the protection of vulnerable children. "Anna, I need to talk to you about a very serious situation," Mrs. Davison said, entering the office without ceremony. The counselor looked up from the papers she was analyzing. "Mrs. Davison, so good to see you. What brings you here today?" "A child in danger. My neighbor, I'm sure she's being mistreated." The employee straightened in her chair, her expression becoming immediately serious. During her 5 years as a Child Protective Services counselor, she had learned to recognize when a complaint was serious. And Mrs. Davison wasn't the type of person who would make frivolous accusations. "Tell me everything," Anna said, grabbing a complaint form. While the educator reported her observations on the other side of the city, Robert was in a similar meeting at the district attorney's office. The prosecutor listened carefully while Robert presented the evidence collected by the millionaire. "This is compelling evidence," the prosecutor said, examining the videos on Robert's cell phone. I'm going to order an immediate investigation and request the removal of the child from the family environment. How long will that take? Robert asked, concerned. With this evidence, we can act today, the prosecutor replied. I'm going to contact Child Protective Services now. That's how, by a coincidence that would change the girl's destiny, two simultaneous complaints reached Child Protective Services on the same morning. Anna was finishing writing down the teacher's report when her phone rang. Child Protective Services, Anna speaking. Anna, this is Prosecutor Lucas. I need you to do an urgent intervention at a house on Main Street. We have evidence of serious child abuse. Anna paused, the pen suspended over the paper. Is it number 127 by any chance? Yellow Victorian house? Exactly. How did you know? I just received a complaint about the same house, Anna replied, looking at the teacher with surprise. Two independent sources. This confirms the seriousness of the situation. At 2 in the afternoon, a coordinated operation was being set up. Anna, accompanied by 2 social workers and a court officer, was heading towards Main Street. Mrs. Davison had offered to accompany the team, using her experience with traumatized children. The millionaire watched everything from his window, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, after days of paralysis, he had managed to act. Robert was by his side, both witnessing the moment that would change the girl's life forever. You did the right thing, Robert said, placing his hand on his friend's shoulder. I hope it's not too late, the businessman replied, his eyes fixed on the team approaching the Victorian house. In the house, the aunt had gone out to buy alcohol at the bar, leaving the girl locked in the stuffy room. The child continued to sing softly, unaware that her life was about to change radically. When Anna knocked on the door of the Victorian house and received no answer, she used her legal authority to enter the property. What they found inside surpassed even their worst expectations. A dirty and poorly maintained house, a strong smell of alcohol, and obvious signs of neglect in every room. It was the teacher who first heard the weak voice coming from the room in the back. There's someone here, she said, guiding the team down the hall. When they opened the door to the room and found the girl huddled in the corner, singing her sad song, everyone present felt a pang in their heart. The child raised her big, frightened eyes, not understanding who these people were or what they wanted from her. Hi, sweetheart, Anna said, crouching down to be at the child's height. My name is Anna. We're here to help you. The girl looked at Mrs. Davison, recognizing the gentle lady who had spoken with her in the yard. A glimmer of hope shone in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by fear. Auntie's going to be mad, she whispered. You don't need to worry about that now. Mrs. Davison said, reaching out to the girl, We're going to get you out of here, okay? And so, after 8 months of silent suffering, the girl was finally removed from the house where she had known only pain and fear, beginning a journey that would lead her back to the light she had lost when her parents departed this world. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment what you thought of my story, giving it a rating from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.